I still remember the exact sound my knees made when they hit the hardwood floor of our bedroom that Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a crash or a thud. It was more like a creak, followed by this hollow silence that seemed to swallow every other noise in the house. My husband Marcus stood over me, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow across the cream-colored carpet where our twin daughters, Lily and Emma, had been playing with their stuffed rabbits just an hour before. He wasn't yelling. That's what made it worse. His voice was calm, measured, almost clinical when he said the words that would destroy everything we'd built over the last 8 years. He was leaving us, not for another woman, not because he'd fallen out of love. He was leaving because his mother, Catherine Aldridge, had given him an ultimatum, and he'd chosen her money over our 6-month-old babies. If you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And please, check the description box below for more stories like this one, because what I'm about to tell you, what I lived through, it changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm 43 now. Back then, I was 35, a former marketing director who'd put her career on hold to raise our surprise twin girls. Marcus was 38, a corporate attorney at his family's law firm in Boston, where old money meets new ambition and everything in between gets crushed under the weight of expectations. We lived in a beautiful colonial in Wellesley, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always perfectly manicured and nobody ever talks about their problems. From the outside, we were the picture of success. Inside, I was bleeding out on that bedroom floor while my husband packed a Louis Vuitton suitcase his mother had given him for Christmas. Catherine had never liked me. From the moment Marcus brought me home to meet her, I could feel her cold appraisal, the way her eyes traveled from my department store dress to my state school background. I wasn't from their world. My father was a plumber in Worcester. My mother worked retail at Macy's. I'd put myself through UMass Amherst waiting tables and graduated with honors, but to Catherine, I would always be the girl who wasn't quite good enough for her son. She tolerated me during our engagement, smiled through our wedding at the country club, but when I got pregnant, something shifted. It wasn't joy. It was fear. Fear that her bloodline was being diluted. Fear that her control was slipping. The pregnancy was difficult. At 28 weeks, I was put on bed rest because Emma wasn't growing properly. Marcus seemed concerned at first, bringing me magazines and staying home from work early. But Catherine started calling more frequently, always when I was trying to rest, always with some emergency that required Marcus's immediate attention at the firm. Her husband, Gerald, had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving her with a fortune estimated at somewhere north of $40 million and an empire of commercial real estate holdings across New England. Marcus was her only child. The firm bore the Aldridge name. In her mind, everything belonged to her, including her son's future. The twins came at 34 weeks, tiny and pink and perfect despite their early arrival. Lily weighed 4 pounds, 2 ounces. Emma was 3 pounds, 15 ounces. They spent 3 weeks in the NICU, and I practically lived in that hospital, pumping breast milk every 2 hours, singing to them through the plastic walls of their incubators, promising them a life full of love and safety. Marcus visited, but he was distracted. His phone was always ringing. Catherine was always calling. The firm needed him. An important client needed him. His mother needed him. When we finally brought the girls home, I thought things would get better. I thought Marcus would fall in love with them the way I had, that he'd see their tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb and understand that nothing else mattered. But Catherine had other plans. She started coming to the house unannounced, critiquing everything from the way I swaddled the babies to the formula I supplemented with when my milk supply couldn't keep up with 2 hungry mouths. She hired a nanny without consulting me, a stern woman named Patricia who reported everything back to Catherine. She bought the girls a nursery's worth of designer clothes and furniture, all of it monogrammed with the Aldridge name, as if she was marking her territory. And then came the letter. Not the one that would change everything later, but the one that started the countdown to my destruction. It arrived on a Monday morning in March, delivered by Catherine's personal attorney, a shark-faced man named Howard Brennan who'd known Marcus since he was a boy. The letter was addressed to both of us, but Marcus read it alone in his study while I was upstairs changing Emma's diaper. When he emerged, his face was ashen. His hands were shaking. He wouldn't look at me. Catherine had rewritten her will. The new version, included a clause that would disinherit Marcus completely if he remained married to me and raising children she deemed unsuitable influences on the Aldridge legacy. The language was careful, legally airtight. Howard had explained it to Marcus in detail. If Marcus wanted to inherit the firm, the properties, the investments, the $40 million that would set him up for life, he had to make a choice. Me and the twins, or his future. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart, you know exactly how I felt in that moment when he finally told me. It wasn't just shock. It was a physical sensation, like falling through ice into freezing water, your lungs seizing up, your brain unable to process what's happening fast enough to save you. I begged him to fight it. I told him we could contest the will, hire our own lawyers, prove that Catherine was manipulating him out of spite. But Marcus just kept shaking his head, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, like he couldn't bear to actually look at me while he dismantled our life. He said his mother would tie everything up in court for years. He said the firm would suffer. He said he'd already talked to Howard about the best way to proceed with a divorce that would satisfy Catherine's terms while still providing for the girls. There was a trust fund, he said. A small one. Enough for their education and basic needs. But he wouldn't be in their lives. He couldn't be. Not if he wanted his inheritance. I asked him how much I was worth. How much were his daughters worth? He didn't answer. He just kept packing. That night, after Marcus left for a hotel downtown, I sat in the nursery between the twins' cribs and watched them sleep. Lily had her fist curled under her chin. Emma was sprawled out like a starfish, her little chest rising and falling with each breath. They had no idea their father had just walked away from them. They had no idea their grandmother had decided they weren't worth loving. I made a promise to them in that dark room, with only the glow of their night light illuminating their innocent faces. I promised I would protect them. I promised I would make this right. I promised that someday, somehow, Catherine Aldridge would pay for what she'd done to our family. I just didn't know how yet. The divorce papers arrived exactly 1 week after Marcus moved out. They were delivered by courier on a Tuesday morning while I was trying to get the twins down for their nap, both of them crying in stereo because they could feel my stress radiating off me in waves. I signed for the envelope with Emma balanced on my hip, her tiny hands grabbing at my hair while Lily wailed from her swing in the living room. The courier, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, gave me the sympathetic look that made me want to scream. I didn't need his pity. I needed my husband back. I needed my life back. But what I got instead was a 50-page document outlining exactly how Marcus planned to erase himself from our existence while keeping his inheritance intact. The terms were brutal. Marcus would relinquish all parental rights. He would pay minimal child support, just enough to avoid looking completely heartless in court, but nothing close to what the twins would need for a stable life. The house would be sold. I'd get half the proceeds, which sounds generous until you realize Marcus's mother had given us the down payment as a wedding gift, and she was now claiming it as a loan that needed to be repaid before any equity could be divided. I'd walk away with maybe $70,000 after everything was settled. In the Boston area, that wouldn't even cover a year's rent and childcare for 2 infants. I called Marcus's cell phone 16 times that day. He never picked up. I left voicemails that started calm and ended with me sobbing into the phone, begging him to reconsider, reminding him of every promise he'd ever made. I told him about the day we found out we were having twins, how he'd picked me up and spun me around in the doctor's office, laughing like he'd just won the lottery. I told him about the night Emma stopped breathing in the NICU, and how he'd held me in the hallway while I fell apart, whispering that everything would be okay because we were a family. I told him I still loved him. I told him the girls needed him. He texted back once, "Please stop calling. My lawyer will be in touch." That's when I realized Marcus wasn't coming back. He'd made his choice, and I'd lost. The next 3 months were a blur of legal meetings, financial stress, and sleepless nights. I hired an attorney named Rebecca Chun, a tough-as-nails family law specialist who came highly recommended and charged $300 an hour I didn't have. She reviewed the divorce papers and just shook her head. Catherine's lawyer had been thorough. There were no loopholes, no angles we could exploit. The trust fund Marcus had mentioned, it existed, but it was controlled by Catherine until the girls turned 25, with distributions at her discretion. She could give them nothing if she wanted. The child support was calculated based on Marcus's salary at the firm, not on his expected inheritance, which meant it was a fraction of what he could actually afford. Rebecca asked me if I wanted to fight it, if I wanted to drag Catherine and Marcus through court, make them defend their actions in front of a judge, expose the cruelty of what they were doing. But she also warned me that it could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars I didn't have. Catherine had unlimited resources. She could bury me in legal fees until I had nothing left. And even if I won, what would I win? A father who didn't want his children? A grandmother who saw them as obstacles? I told Rebecca to negotiate the best settlement she could and get me out. The house sold in June. Marcus never came back to get his things. He sent movers while I was at my mother's place in Worcester, and when I returned, half the furniture was gone. His closet was empty. His office was stripped bare. It was like he'd never existed, except for the ghost of him that haunted every room. I packed up the twins' nursery by myself, wrapping their tiny clothes in tissue paper, dismantling their cribs with a screwdriver and tears streaming down my face. My mother helped me move into a small 2-bedroom apartment in Framingham, 40 minutes west of the life I'd built in Wellesley. The neighborhood was fine, safe enough, but it wasn't home. The walls were thin. The carpet smelled like old cigarettes. The twins cried more, like they knew we'd been exiled. I tried to go back to work, but daycare for twins was almost $3,000 a month, and the marketing jobs I was qualified for didn't pay enough to cover that plus rent and everything else. I took freelance projects, working late into the night after the girls were asleep, designing websites and social media campaigns for small businesses that paid in installments and sometimes not at all. My savings dwindled. My mother helped when she could, but she was living on a fixed income. I started buying generic formula. I shopped at thrift stores for baby clothes. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror. And through it all, I thought about Catherine Aldridge in her mansion in Brookline, sleeping soundly in her 4-poster bed, completely unbothered by the destruction she'd caused. Then came the day everything shifted. It was a Saturday in late August, unseasonably cool for summer, and I was at the grocery store with the twins in one of those enormous double strollers that barely fit down the aisles. I was in the cereal section, trying to decide between the store brand and the name brand, when I saw her. Catherine. She was 3 aisles over, in the organic section, examining a bottle of olive oil like it was a fine wine. She was wearing white linen pants and a navy blazer, her silver hair perfectly styled, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat. She looked untouchable. Untouched. Our eyes met for just a second. She recognized me. I saw it in the slight widening of her eyes, the barely perceptible tightening of her mouth. And then she looked away, turning her back to me like I was nobody, like I hadn't carried her grandchildren in my body, like I hadn't loved her son with everything I had. That's when something inside me broke. Or maybe it crystallized. I can't really explain it, but standing there in that grocery store, staring at the back of Catherine Aldridge's head, I stopped feeling sad. I stopped feeling helpless. What I felt was rage. Pure, white-hot, clarifying rage. If you're still watching, make sure you check the description box for more stories like this. Because what happened next, what I discovered in the weeks that followed, it wasn't what I expected. And it changed everything. I started digging. I'd spent 8 years in marketing, and one thing that job taught me was how to research, how to find information people didn't want found. I started with Catherine's business holdings, public records I could access through the county clerk's office. I requested documents from the probate court about Gerald's estate. I searched old newspaper archives for mentions of the Aldridge family. I joined Facebook groups for people who'd worked at the firm over the years and started asking careful questions about the family's history. And I found something, a thread I could pull, a secret Catherine had buried so deep she thought it would never surface. Gerald Aldridge, Marcus's father, had another child, a daughter from a brief relationship before he married Catherine. Her name was Sarah Brennan, and she was 51 years old, living in Portland, Maine, working as a schoolteacher. Gerald had supported her quietly for years, sending checks through his personal attorney, Howard Brennan's father, which explained the family connection, but he'd never acknowledged her publicly. Catherine knew about Sarah. She'd always known, but she'd made sure Gerald will left Sarah nothing, claiming the support he'd given her over the years was more than generous, that she had no claim to the Aldridge fortune. Except Gerald had written a letter to Sarah, drafted just months before he died, expressing his regret for never being the father she deserved. In it, he'd promised to amend his will to include her as a rightful heir. He told her he loved her. He told her he was sorry. Catherine had that letter. She'd found it in Gerald's desk after he died. And she destroyed it. Or so she thought. I found Sarah Brennan on a Thursday afternoon in September. Not physically. Not yet. But I found her digital footprint, the outline of a life lived quietly in the shadow of a family that had never claimed her. Her Facebook profile was mostly private, but her profile picture showed a woman with kind eyes and Gerald's distinctive nose, the same slightly crooked shape Marcus had. She taught 3rd grade at a public school in Portland. She had a husband, 2 grown sons, a golden retriever named Biscuit. She posted pictures of sunsets over Casco Bay and book recommendations and recipes for apple pie. She looked happy. She looked nothing like someone who'd been denied a $40 million inheritance. I created a fake profile, not because I wanted to deceive her, but because I needed to approach this carefully. I needed to know if she even knew what Catherine had done. I sent her a friend request with a message explaining that I was researching the Aldrich family for a project and wondered if she'd be willing to talk. It was vague enough to be harmless, but specific enough to catch her attention if she cared about her father's family. She responded within 2 hours. We started messaging back and forth, slowly at first, dancing around the real subject. She told me she'd grown up knowing Gerald was her father, but that he'd asked her to keep it private to protect his marriage. He'd paid for her college. He'd walked her down the aisle at her wedding, though the guest list was told he was a family friend. He'd met her children when they were born. He'd been present in his way, but never publicly, never in a way that would threaten Catherine's world. Sarah said she'd made peace with it. She said she understood the complications of his situation. But then she said something that made my heart race. She told me that just before Gerald died, he called her and told her he was going to make things right. He said he'd lived too long with the regret of hiding her, and he wanted to change his will. He wanted her to be recognized. He wanted her to have her share of what he'd built. And then he'd had a massive stroke, dying 3 days later before he could meet with his attorney. I asked her if he'd written anything down, if there was any proof of his intentions. She said he'd mentioned a letter, but after he died, she'd asked Catherine about it, and Catherine had told her there was no letter, that Gerald had been confused in his final days, that his will was clear and final. Sarah had believed her. She'd accepted what she was told because she had no reason not to. Catherine was Gerald's widow. Howard Brennan was the family attorney. If they said there was no letter, there was no letter. Except I knew there was, because I'd found a reference to it in Howard Brennan's father's old files, records that had been digitized and stored in the Massachusetts State Archives for cases dating back 40 years. The elder Brennan had kept meticulous notes, and buried in his records from September 2019 was a notation about receiving a sealed envelope from Gerald Aldrich with instructions to deliver it to Sarah Brennan upon Gerald's death. The envelope was logged, signed for, and then, according to the records, it had been returned to Catherine at her request, marked void per family attorney. Catherine had intercepted it. She'd used Howard to get the letter back before Sarah ever saw it, and then she'd made it disappear. I told Sarah everything. I sent her copies of the archive records. I explained who I was, why I was looking into this, what Catherine had done to me and Marcus and my daughters. I told her about the ultimatum, about how Catherine had destroyed my family to protect her control of the Aldrich fortune. I told her that the letter she'd been promised existed, and that Catherine had stolen it. Sarah called me the next day. Her voice was shaking. She said she'd always wondered if Gerald really meant to include her, or if she'd just imagined the hope in his voice during that last phone call. She said she'd spent 6 years believing she wasn't worth fighting for, that her father had ultimately chosen Catherine's version of the family over acknowledging his own daughter. But now, knowing the truth, knowing that he'd tried and Catherine had stopped him, she wanted justice. Not revenge, she said. Justice. I told her I wanted the same thing. But I also told her my plan. And it involved Marcus. Because here's what I'd realized during all those months of digging through records and piecing together Catherine's lies. Marcus didn't know about Sarah. Catherine had kept her existence a secret from him his entire life. Marcus thought he was an only child, the sole heir, the only person who mattered in his mother's world. If he found out his mother had hidden a half-sister from him, if he found out she'd stolen Sarah's inheritance and manipulated Gerald's final wishes, it would destroy his trust in her. It would make him question everything. And if Marcus questioned Catherine, if he turned against her, the entire foundation of her control would crumble. So I drafted a letter. Not from me, because Marcus would never read anything I sent him. But from Sarah. A letter introducing herself as his half-sister, explaining their father's final wishes, and asking for his help in honoring Gerald's memory by including her in the family she'd been denied. I included copies of the archive records. I included a notarized statement from a handwriting expert confirming that the signature on the elder Brennan's files matched Gerald's signature on other legal documents. I made it impossible to dismiss. Sarah signed it. She added a personal note about memories of their father, details only someone who knew Gerald intimately would know. She told Marcus she wasn't asking for money. She was asking for acknowledgement, for truth. We sent it via certified mail to Marcus's office at the firm. We sent a copy to Howard Brennan, and we sent one to Catherine's house, addressed to her personally. Then we waited. The response came faster than I expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, almost 3 weeks after we'd sent the letters. I was feeding the twins mashed sweet potatoes, Emma wearing more of it than she was eating, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Marcus. His voice sounded hollowed out, like something had been scooped out of him and left him empty. He said Catherine had lied to him his entire life. He said he'd confronted her about Sarah, and she'd admitted it, but only after Howard confirmed the documents were real and threatened to resign if she continued denying the truth. He said his mother had cried, had told him she did it to protect him, to protect the family legacy, that Gerald had been weak and sentimental and she'd had to be strong. She begged him to understand. But Marcus couldn't understand. Because if his mother had lied about Sarah, what else had she lied about? He asked me if I knew. If I'd been the one who found his half-sister. I told him yes. I told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel his world reshaping itself around this new reality. And then he said the words I'd been waiting months to hear. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he was sorry. But here's the thing about apologies after betrayal. They don't fix what's broken. They don't erase the nights I spent sobbing in an empty apartment while my daughters slept in secondhand cribs. They don't give me back the year I lost, the security I lost, the life I'd built that he helped destroy. I told Marcus I couldn't talk right now. I told him I needed time to process. And I hung up. Because the truth was, I didn't know if I wanted him back. But I knew I wanted Catherine to pay. The first call came at 6 a.m, 3 days after I hung up on Marcus. It was Rebecca Chen, my attorney, her voice sharp with urgency. She said Catherine Aldridge had filed an emergency petition to contest Gerald's will, claiming new evidence had surfaced that questioned his mental competency in his final months. It was a desperate move, a Hail Mary attempt to block Sarah from making any legal claims on the estate. But Rebecca said it also meant Catherine was scared. People who are confident don't file emergency petitions at dawn. They don't scramble. They don't make mistakes. And Catherine was about to make several. The hearing was scheduled for late October in Suffolk County Probate Court. Sarah hired her own attorney, a fierce woman named Diane Torres who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for eviscerating witnesses on cross-examination. Marcus, to everyone's surprise, hired an attorney separate from his mother's and filed his own motion to reopen Gerald's estate for proper review of his father's final intentions. Howard Brennan tried to stay neutral, claiming attorney-client privilege, but Diane subpoenaed him anyway. The whole thing was about to become a public spectacle, exactly what Catherine had spent years trying to avoid. I wasn't a party to the case, not officially, but Diane asked me to testify about what I'd found in my research. She said my testimony about the archive records and Catherine's pattern of manipulation would be crucial. Rebecca warned me that taking the stand would open me up to cross-examination from Catherine's attorneys, that they'd try to paint me as a vindictive ex-daughter-in-law out for revenge. But I didn't care. I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted Catherine to face what she'd done. The weeks leading up to the hearing were chaos. Marcus started showing up at my apartment, unannounced, asking to see the twins. The first time it happened, I almost slammed the door in his face. But Emma saw him through the screen and reached out her little arms, saying "Dada" in that sweet, uncertain way babies do when they recognize someone from a dream or a memory. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't deny my daughters their father, even if I wasn't sure I could ever forgive him. So I let him in, just for an hour, just to sit on the floor and stack blocks with his daughters while I watched from the kitchen, my arms crossed, my heart a war zone of conflicting emotions. He looked different, thinner, older. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He played with Lily and Emma like he was trying to memorize them, like he knew he'd lost something irreplaceable and was desperately trying to figure out if he could get it back. After he left, he sent me a text. "I'm going to make this right. I promise." I didn't respond. I'd heard his promises before. The hearing lasted 3 days. Catherine showed up in black Chanel, her armor of wealth and respectability, flanked by 2 attorneys who each probably cost more per hour than I made in a month. She sat ramrod straight in the gallery, her face a mask of controlled fury. Marcus sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, deliberately avoiding her gaze. Sarah sat with her husband, looking small and nervous and completely out of place in this world of old money and legal warfare. Diane Torres called me to the stand on day 2. I swore on the Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then I told the story of how I'd found Sarah, how I'd traced the letter, how I'd uncovered Catherine's lies. Catherine's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Preston Carmichael, tried to rattle me during cross-examination. He suggested I was biased, that I was making up evidence to get revenge on my ex-mother-in-law. He implied I'd fabricated documents. He questioned my motives, my character, my fitness as a mother. But I didn't break, because everything I said was true, and I had the receipts to prove it. The judge, an older woman named Judith Kowalski, who'd been on the bench for 30 years, listened to everything with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. When Preston tried to exclude the archive records as hearsay, she overruled him. When Diane asked to enter Gerald's medical records into evidence, proving he'd been fully competent right up until his stroke, Judge Kowalski allowed it. And when Howard Brennan finally took the stand and admitted, under oath, that his father had logged the letter and that Catherine had requested it back before Sarah could receive it, the entire courtroom went silent. Catherine's mask cracked. Just for a moment, I saw pure panic flash across her face before she smoothed it away. But it was too late. Judge Kowalski had seen it too. The ruling came 2 weeks later. Judge Kowalski found that Gerald Aldridge had been of sound mind and body when he expressed his intention to include Sarah Brennan in his estate. She found that Catherine had knowingly interfered with Gerald's final wishes by intercepting the letter meant for Sarah. She ordered the estate reopened and redistributed according to what Gerald's documented intentions had been. Sarah was entitled to 1/3 of Gerald's estate. Marcus would receive 1/3, and the final third would remain in trust for any future grandchildren, which now included Lily and Emma. Catherine was going to lose $13 million. More importantly, she was going to lose her absolute control over Marcus. The firm would be restructured. The properties would be divided. Her empire would be dismantled, piece by piece, because she'd been too arrogant to believe anyone would ever question her. The fallout was swift and brutal. Catherine's friends in Brookline society, the same people who'd smiled at her fundraisers and complimented her taste, started distancing themselves. Whispers spread about her cruelty, her manipulation, the way she'd hidden her husband's daughter and stolen an inheritance. The firm lost clients who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Howard Brennan retired early, his reputation damaged by his role in helping Catherine cover up the truth. And Marcus finally saw his mother for who she really was. Not the strong, protective matriarch she'd always claimed to be, but a controlling, ruthless woman who valued money and status over people, over family, over her own granddaughters. He came to my apartment the day the ruling was announced. This time I was expecting him. I'd made coffee. The twins were down for a nap. We sat at my tiny kitchen table, the same one I bought secondhand from a thrift store in Framingham, and he told me he wanted to be a father. He wanted to be a real father, not a monthly child support check, not a trust fund administrator. He wanted to read bedtime stories and change diapers and show up to parent-teacher conferences. He said he'd spent the last year living with the consequences of his choices, and he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't live knowing he'd abandoned his children because his mother told him to. I asked him what changed. Why now? Why, after everything, was he suddenly willing to fight for us when he hadn't been willing to fight for us before? He said the letter, the one Sarah had sent him, reading it, seeing his father's signature on those documents, realizing his mother had lied to him his entire life, it had broken something fundamental in him. If she'd lied about Sarah, if she'd stolen Sarah's inheritance, if she'd manipulated Gerald's final wishes, then everything Marcus had believed about his family, about loyalty, about what mattered, it was all built on lies. And he couldn't build his life on lies anymore. I told him I didn't know if I could trust him. I told him he'd have to prove himself, not with money or grand gestures, but with consistency, with showing up, with being present even when it was hard, even when his mother tried to pull him back into her orbit, even when choosing his daughters meant disappointing the people he'd spent his whole life trying to please. He said he understood. He said he'd spend the rest of his life earning back what he'd thrown away. I don't know if we'll ever be a family again, not the way we were before. Too much has been broken. Too much trust has been shattered. But I do know that Lily and Emma have their father back. They have a trust fund that will secure their future. They have a half-aunt in Portland who sends them birthday cards and Christmas presents and wants to know them. They have a grandmother who's been forced to acknowledge them, even if she'll never truly accept them. And I have something I didn't have a year ago. I have my power back. I spent months feeling helpless, feeling like Catherine had destroyed my life and there was nothing I could do about it. But I was wrong. There was something I could do. I could dig. I could search. I could find the truth and bring it into the light. I could force the people who'd hurt me to face consequences. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about justice. Sometimes it's about making sure the people who've wronged you can't keep hurting others. Sometimes it's about taking back the narrative they tried to write for you and writing your own ending instead. Catherine still lives in her mansion in Brookline, but she's not untouchable anymore. She's not the queen of Boston society. She's the woman who hid her stepdaughter and stole from her own son. That's her legacy now. That's what people will remember. And me, I'm rebuilding. I moved to a better apartment in Newton, closer to good schools, with a small yard where the twins can play. I started a marketing consultancy that's actually doing well. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, when Catherine had slowly isolated me from anyone who wasn't part of her approved social circle. I'm dating again, tentatively, not because I need a man to complete me, but because I'm finally ready to believe I deserve good things. Sarah and I have become friends, real friends, the kind born from shared trauma and mutual respect. She's teaching me to let go of bitterness. I'm teaching her it's okay to be angry, to take up space, to demand what's owed to you. We meet for coffee once a month. Our families getting together for holidays, creating something new from the wreckage Catherine left behind. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing what I survived and what I fought for. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt powerless in the face of someone else's cruelty, I hope my story reminds you that you're stronger than you think. That the truth, even when it's buried deep, has a way of surfacing if you're willing to dig for it. Check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about survival, about justice, about people who refuse to let others define their worth. And remember, the people who try to break you often end up breaking themselves. You just have to be patient enough to watch it happen. Lily just turned 2 last month. Emma is already trying to use full sentences. They don't remember the man their father was when he walked away from them. They only know the man he's trying to become. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the real victory, not the money or the court ruling or Catherine's downfall, but the fact that my daughters will grow up knowing they're loved, that they're worth fighting for, that no inheritance or trust fund or family legacy is more valuable than the people who hold your heart. That afternoon Marcus received the letter from Sarah. His hands trembled because his entire world was about to shift. But my world had already shifted. I'd already been broken and rebuilt. I'd already learned that the only person who could save me was myself. And that's a lesson no trust fund can buy.